You should come to Squad Goals, the three-player team event in Chicago, May 18th and 19th. 32 teams, 96 players, all teaming up for the coolest alternate format in Marvel Crisis Protocol history. SquadGoalsMCP.com, SquadGoalsMCP.com, SquadGoalsMCP.com. I think we're tentatively calling this series Vince Was Wrong About a Thing. And on this episode, we're going to talk about how Vince was wrong about Klaw. With me today is VodkaBlitz. Vodka went, X and 2 at LVO?
I wish. Already, you're wrong about that thing. I went 3-3.
You went 3 and 3? Okay. But was playing a very, very cool, very interesting list at LVO that involved such wild things like Modok 2 and Klaw, like models that people largely considered, to be terrible. I mean, a really smart internet guy once said, Klaw is widely considered the worst model in the game at the moment. And Vodka, what's this Klaw thing about? Why Klaw? Why are you playing around with this? What's going on?
It all started when I was trying to attack against Guardians with X-Men.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking at Klaw because he had like a very interesting and unique profile. Like he has the helmet thing. He's immune to both incinerate and shock. He has a pretty gnarly builder, which can stun and take power away before damage. And just like 5 energy defense with 7 health is pretty chunky into Guardians. The only thing he's really missing is ways to move around, which I figured, like with Field Leader on Cyclops and the X-Men Hop, would probably be good enough to fix him and to help him get going. I played it like 4, 5, 6 games, liked it well enough, not into X-Men, that it made me want to try out his leadership. So I figured, nobody's ever played that guy. I'm going to try it out, see how it works. So I ended up just firing a game on TTS, the LFG. Ended up getting paired against one of the big UK Webs players. And with my the very first rough draft of the list, I ended up losing 15-16 on this like super, super tight game, which made me go like, oh, like this has legs. Like I'm playing against a very solid player playing a well-repped faction, and I ended up losing by a thread. I think there's something there, but I'd like to take the time to explore it. And that's how I got there. Like just trying weird stuff out, experimenting a lot with the list. I went back and forth a lot with a good amount of options because at the end of the day, Klaw's still mostly E-shaped specialist. So trying to figure out like how to build for like the rest of the field, the rest of the scenarios took me a lot of time to figure out play patterns I liked and other characters I liked to complement his style. But that's basically it.
All right. Okay. So I guess with this list, so I'm going to have it up on the screen. Essentially, I guess my question is like, what is the basic premise? Because you have like 9 criminals here, you have 3 leaderships, and your only splash is Hela, Queen of Hell.
Yeah.
So, what are you trying to do? And you have like quite an eclectic selection of crisis. You've got Gamma, Meteors, Demons, Research Station, Hammers, and Montesi. So like 5 of the fighting scenarios, and then Meteors. So like, what's the basic premise? Like, what's the high level, the high concept pitch for the list?
I think that mostly since Klaw is like relatively mobile on a small scale, you want to try to fight as centered as you can. And so he's the main plan for the list. So ideally, I want to fight on like pretty narrow shapes and use the mobility kicker he has to put both scenario and attrition pressure at the same time. Because he gets to weave in and out of the action whenever my characters are dazed or KO. So the idea is really to fight as centrally as possible and try to leverage the mobility he gains from his own leadership, just to make it more effective. Honestly, one of the reasons there's just a lot of CS characters in this is that most of them are picked around the idea of like threat saturation. So the idea is to put a lot of very aggressive, very threatening models like Electra, Killmonger, Ulick to an extent, Bullseye, just to be able to be like very aggressive with my models. But the other thing a lot of these models have in common is that they're relatively fragile. Like Electra's no tank, Killmonger isn't either. Like they're all characters that die somewhat to fairly easily, which helps you trigger Claw's leadership to make sure uh, you keep the tempo and the pressure on your opponents and the scenario. Obviously, like most of my scenarios are fairly low scoring. The I think the fastest one I've got is Hammers, which is on average 2-2. So fairly slow scenarios overall, just to give me that leeway to be able to like catch up on attrition with all of these characters. Um, and the idea between like that for the threat saturation is that you can only daze one of my models at a time, and I'll be able to do the same to you. And trading back and forth these models, I think, pays off because it's built. My leadership is built around that, and it lets me put more pressure on my opponents. Because when Claw moves, I think one of the defining ability of Claw is sonic disruption. So whenever an opposing model ends their activation within 3 of them, he can pay 3 and push them away short. This is a great tool to leverage in order to just put a lot of pressure on secures. Just to be able to push models away, especially on scenarios like Gamma, being able to push them out of Gamma range for a surprising amount of free damage and around helps a lot just control the flow and tempo of the game.
Yeah, this is the thing that actually really excites me about Claw is the sound wave barrier. Like the ability to be like, hey, I have this zone of 6 inches, right? Or if you want to be real generous, 13, like across the entire bubble, and it's just like I can push you away, and if you want to stand at a point, a short push guarantees you off it unless you can backstop yourself,
Yeah.
or you're something
And
like Colossus that can't be pushed.
yeah. Like there's a very few exceptions, and that for me is honestly the defining ability of Claw more than anything else is just sound wave barrier because it gives you so much control if you can leverage your positioning correctly, which I think was the thing that took me the longest time to like figure out how to play and sequence properly. Just being able to like weave in and out and be able to like the classic key pattern that's going to come up a lot if you play this kind of list is that someone attacks your model twice, dazes them, Claw moves in, they end their activation, you push them away. And being able to do that like 2-3 times around sometimes really puts a surprising amount of pressure on scenario for your opponent and is a very good tool to deal with opposing scenario. The one exception there would be Hellfire because Emma can shield bind them, but it's still a very relevant tool. And I think that's Soundwave Barrier is what Claw spends most of his power on. Like it
Yeah,
costs 3, it's fairly expensive, but Claw also builds power surprisingly well.
yeah, that's one of the things. So I've played this list twice. I've lost terribly both times, but but also I'm playing the list blind. We didn't talk about this beforehand. I watched your games at I watched your 2 streamed games at LVO, and then I was like, let's try to play this list. And rarely, so MCP has a problem of it's not always clear why you lost. It was not unclear why I lost either of these games. My Modok positioning was atrocious. Like when your Modok spends multiple turns just double walking, you've screwed up,
Oh,
buddy. But I think the main thing that really keyed me, or that I really keyed into on those games, is like, what do you do with Claw's power? Because Claw is very, very good at making power.
yeah,
But the beam feels kind of like a trap. Like it doesn't feel significantly better than his builder, and
yeah.
often feels like if they don't already have stun on them, feels like you're kind of doing the opposite of what the list wants to do, which is kind of this like power denial. I get to hit you very hard. It's very like it's hard for you to get your engine rolling and beat me. It's disruption.
Yeah.
Not yeah, it's like disruption attrition if that makes sense.
Yep. To me, it plays somewhat similarly to Shield, where like you have to be very reactive to what your opponent's doing, both in terms of positioning and tools you leverage. Like the tools you use are very different, but I think in principle it's somewhat similar. Where, and I agree entirely with you. Like you want to keep your power for Soundwave Barrier and to let Claw heal himself because he's some like he's still somewhat fragile. Like he's 353, which is a very skewed defense profile. 7 health helps him a lot, and being able to move a lot out of turn to make sure he doesn't get double tapped often makes a big difference. So if you're able to heal him in between, also feels pretty good. Um, and overall, I agree with you. I think the beam is something I use very, very rarely. Maybe once, sometimes twice a game, never more than that. And often it's just either to leverage the extra range from 3 to 5, or to be able to get like 2 key dazes or KOs. Um, Mostly when he's injured. It's something like that doesn't come up super often. I think Soundwave Barrier is like where you want to put your power.
Yeah. The other place that I've noticed that the power is really useful is when you're playing Modok 2, is that keeping the two of them near each other so that Modok can both shunt attacks to the model that can heal
Yeah,
and steal the power that like because sometimes Claw like spikes the thing or spikes the roll. The people aren't coming in to be pushed away by him, or like the one thing that came in, he doesn't want to push away because he's going to kill it.
yeah.
So he has all this power, and the beam isn't very useful. And I think that like can be a really hard thing to do in Marvel is when a character gets power and their output for that power doesn't create more damage. And we're seeing a lot of pieces be released like this. So like Claw is like this.
Yeah.
I think new Doc Ock is like this. Like Doc Ock's damage difference with 10 power and with 3 power is not very big. But he gains the ability to put out useful conditions with his spender. I guess where I want to go next here is like, so you got 3 leaderships.
Yeah.
Where do we kind of, uh, like, where do we look to play these 3 different leaderships? Like, what's our matchup position look like? I assume it's heavily scenario based, but can you elaborate on that?
Yep, I think Claw's the main plan for the list.
Mm-hmm.
But there's some matchups and scenarios he really doesn't like. Um, he's not great on Ds just because there are a type of scenarios that tend to favor high mobility, which Claw's leadership gives, but it's conditional to having your characters dazed, which is less likely to happen on both Ds and Bs. So I don't tend to play him as a leader as much on these shapes. He will sometimes see play under Modok too, more often than not. But he's mostly an E-shape specialist, and where that's where he shines the most. Like just being able to uh, threat project a lot and have Soundwave Barrier be at its most effective. Uh, my second most commonly played leader is actually Modok, just because I think even if I personally think his leadership is pretty unexciting, like it's dice fixing,
Mm-hmm.
it's mostly easy to get. It just requires you to contest or hold an objective. Um, so like it goes pretty much everywhere. It also helps a lot solve get more a better play into Hellfire. Like I was saying, Claw being able to trade Soundwave barriers for Shield Mind is pretty bad. You're trading 3 power and a 5 threat for 2 power and a 4 threat,
Mm-hmm.
which I think just isn't a good trade overall. Like I'd still play Claw in these shapes, but sometimes under Modok leadership, just to help get more tempo into Emma and be able to put more offensive pressure, because converting those successes when you attack them, when you go after them, when you chase them is really important to be able to put a lot of pressure very early on. Um, Otherwise, like on most Ds and Bs, I'll be playing Modok. Kingpin's the leadership I use the least. I think I'll mostly use it on when there's a lot of extracts on the field, um, and on scenarios sometimes like deadly meteors, or when I get uh, like hammers, or like my hammers on a D shape against I'm gonna call it mid-range team. Like I feel Modok plays better into both extremes of attrition and scenario, whereas Kingpin plays well into a lot of the quote unquote regular field, or the teams that sit more towards the middle. Like they can pivot to attrition, they can pivot towards scenario, but don't do either extremely well.
Yeah.
That's when I'm going to bring Kingpin out. And I think the part of the leadership I use the most is really passing extracts. I think it's in the current state of the game, the key defining part of his leadership.
Yeah, I definitely have seen that. When we see, there's a couple videos on my channel of CS play from Second Wind, and the thing that's really, uh, I think, makes a great CS player is when they're playing the king or a great kingpin player, I should say, when they're playing the extract passing version of it and making it very hard for you to get the extracts back off of them. I find it very interesting that you say so. Like, I guess we can call that kind of team mid range. That's like playing both sides of the game and just going to kind of pivot to whichever one's going better, or
Yeah.
whichever one their opponent does worst. That's where you think Kingpin does the best. Is that because like they don't have the damage to overcome his hit points, and then his leadership gives him a leg up on the other department, and just it's too much for them? Or why do you feel that like mid range struggles in a Kingpin?
I think just being able to steal secures on round one, sometimes round two, then break parity on extracts with characters like Black Hat and Rhino, then pass them away. So on round one, I'll be a little aggressive and extend just to steal secure points. Then after like going into round two and three, I'll try to steal their extracts and then pass them on to my mobile characters. Like in this list, a lot of the list is surprisingly mobile. Like you got Black Hat, Hela, Rhino. Um, you have like all of these characters that have either extra movement or long movement from the get-go, which helps you like get going and forces your opponent to come after you. Since you've broken parity round one and two, it's a lot harder for them to catch up if they have to run after you, and you just rotate on secures, keeping the extract lead.
So earlier you said Kingpin, you would play him on meteors. Did I mishear that? You
Yep.
wouldn't.
No. Sometimes I would play him on Meteor, either him or Modok. Um, Honestly, it changes a lot of depending on what I'm facing. If I'm expecting a lot of ways to displace Modok more than Kickbin, um, or just if I expect a huge amount of control, I'll sometimes just play Kingpin just to be able to play more aggressively on the extract and fight for parity on the secures. But that's a very like uh, narrow aspect of the plan. And honestly, I think Deadly Meteors is probably on his way out of my list.
Okay.
I've been playing recently with Intrusion a lot, which I think I like more than Deadly Meteors there.
Okay. Just okay. Like a million questions. So I just found that very interesting because like everyone thinks of like don't play Kingpin on flips. His leadership doesn't do anything for flip scenarios. But it's interesting that you think he's more resilient to control than Modok because Modok has helmet. Is it just that like him having to like double walk, like he can still have impact on the game and Modok can't, or like why do you feel that that works that way?
I think even with helmet, Modok getting thrown is a lot rougher than Kingpin, just because since Kingpin has access to a really cheap throw, I don't mind him as much getting thrown as Modok. Like he can still displace another model to help me flip a trap, or just being able to pass those extracts, especially if we're playing like Hammers or Montesi, being able to trade them around to make sure my opponent can steal them from me, has been really big. Like so, I think both Kingpin and Modok are really more the matchup dependent leaderships of this list. Like I like having both plans as a backup, I think Modok by far is the one I use the most. But I still like well enough Kingpins and the options he provides to keep playing.
Okay. Yeah, and so like with the Modok leadership, like you get thrown off, like your Modok gets thrown off the point. Now the leadership is turned off, right? And you have to spend an action walking back on the point, and then you get one attack, and maybe you have the power to use the spender to move them. Maybe you don't.
Yeah,
Whereas Kingpin probably just walks back on the point and throws you off of it.
yeah, pretty much. And like sometimes I'll be playing either of them under the other's leadership. Like that's
Mm.
one of the things I really like is just like that level of flexibility with all your models and all your leaders to be able to play any one of them under any one of them to fairly effective use, I think is really a big upside of this list. And it's a surprisingly good way to bamboozle your opponent. Like, um, just for them not to know on which foot you're going to dance. Uh, just to be like, if it since it can be any of the three leaders, it's very hard to predict for your opponent what you're going to field and what they think you're going to field according to like the that mind game and that
Yeah,
just anticipation of what's the other one going to put on the table, what do I expect, what do I think they expect, and to play around those expectations I think is a really strong suit of that list.
yeah, it's like a one-sided list chicken, where it's like, okay, I have a Kingpin counter and I have a Claw counter, right? Which one?
You know,
Which one
well,
do I do? Like, I
yeah,
got a million physical attacks, or I've got a bunch of energy attacks. Like, which way do I go? All
yeah,
right. That's interesting. Okay. So I think the thing I want to go ahead and dig in again, because you talk a lot about the positioning of the list, and like it's hard to do in this kind of like pseudo podcasty format of talking about like how you position Claw. But I want to talk a little bit about the leadership and the stuff the leadership unlocks and kind of like how it functions. As like on paper, it looks like maybe the worst leadership in the game. It looks really bad on paper. Like it's when a friendly non-claw model dies or dazed or KO'd, Claw can move short. If Claw is dazed, he can't use this, right?
yep, that is correct.
Yeah. So if your leader's dazed, you just don't have a leadership, unlike every other leadership in the game.
Yep.
But even with that, with the way that like the grunts work in CS, and I it just has like a lot of really interesting turn one connotations. Like in your game against, I don't even remember what it was, but it had an eye Hulk in it. Is all I remember about this game. Was it Webs?
It was
It was
Wakanda.
Wakanda.
I
That's what it
think it
was.
was Brandon was his name.
Yeah, yeah. It was a Wakanda game, and it had eye Hulk in it. And I just remember like it was on Hammers, and so like the walk me through your opening on Hammers with like the Electra Claw plan.
Yeah. So usually, like one of the reasons I have Hela as a splash there is for a safe extract on either of the sides. So usually round one, very classic, safe extract to side hammer with Hela, ideally. And then my opponent goes, they probably do the same. The subsequent play that also works on Montesi, and very importantly also works on Montesi, is being able to go with Electra, have the grunts move towards your home extract, pick it up, and then pass it on to another model. If it's a hammer, usually I like to give it to Claw just because he then gets a short advance. Hela gains a soul. And with that short advance, it means Claw is able, if unobstructed by terrain, to just single move to the center point. That allows you to put a lot of pressure very early on because 7 die energy builder with stun and
Bad
power
sap.
suppression
Yeah, suppression.
is really gross. Like it hits fairly hard, even with no dice. Like with no dice fixing, you're a little more subject to variance, but usually it goes your way. Um, so after that, the nice thing is also if we're also playing a very central secure. If my I can sometimes wait for my opponent to bring one of their models on the central line because then Electra can move and attack a model on the central line. And if she does that, the grunts are already back up. So they get to pass the extract. You already put them back on the table. And that's the thing with the ninjas is uh, with this list specifically, I think they're the grunts over which you have the best control over when they die and when they spawn. And Electra, very noticeably over Shadowlands Daredevil, has a lot of an easier time to put the grunts back in the field,
Yes.
since she does on her gainer, which is range 3, as opposed to Daredevil's builder on range 2. So you get to churn through grunts surprisingly often in a game.
Yeah, she's also
Uh,
much more mobile than Daredevil is with if you're willing to pay for assassin steps.
and like her gainer is still really good. Like range 3, 5 die with Pierce, Mystic Attack. Like it's pretty solid. And with the extra attacks you get from the ninjas, like that's the thing. Electra specifically and the ninjas is whether or not the ninjas live or die, you don't care as much because if they live, Electra gets a much more higher offensive output with 2 extra 4 die attack, and if they die, you get to control whether and where your leader moves,
Mm-hmm.
which then turns into additional control with Soundwave Barrier. So there's no bad outcomes for the ninjas whether they live or die, which I think is catches a lot of people off guard.
Yeah, so that's like the thing is, so they're largely considered the worst grunts, but they're also the easiest to put back in play. So if you're looking for death triggers on things like Hela and things like Claw leadership, if you're looking for constant death triggers, they're the cheapest to put back out. Like, because
Yeah,
it's very expensive for Nick Fury to pay those 2 power with what his power can do. Ultron has to generate a throw, and ideally a throw that's not his throw.
yeah.
And then I guess Red Skulls come out for free, but also Red Skull is like it's yeah.
They come off staggered, and if you want to churn through them constantly, they just move and die, move and die, move and die, and
Yeah.
then they're not doing as much as they could.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is both Claw and Red Skull 2 share a very similar defensive profile, meaning that they have big health pool, but relatively low and weak defenses.
Mm-hmm.
So having 10 threat worth of very fragile characters is super, super dangerous. And I think it's one of the things I didn't like as much. Like, Electra's not that much more tanky, but I feel much more comfortable doing that with a 4 threat than a second 5 threat.
Yeah, and also Electra has like that evasiveness of both being able to kind of you can use Assassin's Step to escape the way that like sometimes Logan the Wolverine can escape with an attack where he can like kind of compound the two things, and that mixed with stealth and martial prowess means that she's both evasive and can be fairly tanky given
Yeah.
the attack type or based on whether you're willing to pay the power.
And I think, honestly, with Electra, I pay surprisingly often for martial prowess. It's still a superpower I value very lowly. Like,
Yeah.
it's better than nothing, but like it's marginally better than nothing. And I think it gives her a little more survivability, but not that much. Since you can also play with her range like martial artist, um, it's nice. But like sometimes you'll get uh, the exceptional days or KO off it, but not enough to be worried about it. Just make it a little more awkward for your opponent, and that's about it.
Yeah, I mean,
But I really like what she brings to the table, and when she gets to Spender, it usually takes something off the board.
yeah, the Impale, especially if you have the hand ninjas, 10 die, no crits, is really good. And then I think the thing that's really undervalued about the Impale is the medium move afterwards on
Oh
a
yeah,
stealth character.
that makes the biggest difference in the world because it allows you to ideal scenario, you get to do the gainer, assassin step, spender, move away. Honestly, I think with experience, I tend to risk that play pattern a lot less just because assassin step requires you to deal damage with the attack in order to teleport. And I
Mm-hmm.
think if I really want to get a spender off, I'd rather just move, do it, move back.
Mm-hmm.
To make sure I don't miss out. But
Yeah.
that's where one of the tactics card in my list comes in really clutch. With Cruel Tutelage,
Yes.
you can pay one to get 3 extra die on your next attack. If your character rolls a skull, they get staggered. Which, with the coming back to that idea of threat saturation, you honestly don't mind that much. If you're getting off a 13 die attack where your opponents don't count crits and they don't explode, like usually it kills something. And then you can just move back. More often than not, you'll get staggered with that big of a dice pool. Uh, but that's where like playing characters like Modok too, which can deflect attack, makes Electra a much more juicier target to deflect into if she's staggered. Um, so it's these little incremental things that end up like stacking and making a pretty big difference in how you play the list and how you want to position your characters.
Yeah, it's like the list and the list, like I can't stress enough like how ticky tack the like auras and standing everyone in the right spot is. Like this is not an easy list to play, and like a lot of your
Yeah, honestly, like that's the thing that took me the longest time to figure out and learn properly was when and how to leverage all that mobility and all the movement and all that positioning. And it's tricky to get into at first, but it feels super fun and great to play, even when it doesn't work that well. Like when you're learning the ropes, I still had a really good time playing that list. Like, and it's easier to spot your own mistakes and to try to correct them afterwards because you get to see very, very quickly where the mechanism falls short. Like where you ended up short, what distances were awkward. Like you get to see them very quickly in a game and try to course correct. And so, like for every game you play, you get better and better at like uh, positioning your characters in relation to one another.
all right. I okay, so I think we've largely covered the answers to my questions about character selection. I mean, we danced around it, but I think I can answer the question of why Hela over Bill, which is the Souls mechanic and how easily the ninjas dip in and out, right?
Yeah. There's also another reason, like I like Hala's mobility a lot. Just the Death's Embrace they put on her healthy side when she got buffed makes a huge difference. Especially when you're playing on like wider scenarios and pay to flips. Like, yes, she's not as tanky as Bill for Kingpin or Modok, but with the amount of souls you're churning, you're able to leverage your offensive kit significantly better. Just because spending 1 or 2 souls whenever she activates is super easy to do, and you're going to get them back fairly quickly. Another advantage she has when I'm playing Kingpin, since I'm mostly playing Kingpin for the extract passing part, is that when she has 3 souls and she's just running away with 2 or 3 extracts, it's really hard to get rid of her.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been surprisingly effective. Like I had a game in a local tournament, I think it was in October, where I was churning through souls so fast that she came back from the dead 3 times in the same game. Like it's just really absurd the amount of like dazes and KOs that happened on the board with this list overall.
That's great. As I mean, as a person that also loves Hela and likes, you know, uh, loves her on her flip side with 3 souls because I'm playing her in Shield and I have Eye in the Sky protection. I don't have this many dazes and KOs, but I do have Eye in the Sky, and man, that character can be impossible to kill.
Yep. Like she can be really, really obnoxious. And she also contributes the diversity of attack types, which I haven't talked about in that list, but just came up like when I was playing it a lot. Like every one of your characters has different attack types and conditions they put. And I think it's been very surprising, welcoming, very welcome surprise just to be able to have good solid mystic attacks into web, uh, just to be able to put like some physical attacks very effectively into the wizards, and just like the pool of attacks all of your characters have plays together surprisingly well also.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where you like talk about like attack type flexibility, And like on one hand, it doesn't really matter because the difference between hitting something
Yeah,
with def 3 with def 4, def 5, def 3 is like not that different, but it's when it turns off like defensive mechanics that
yeah,
it matters a lot. Like
yeah,
no.
pretty much. Like it's being able to go through spider senses, martial artists, and like I think without Electra, Hela, and Modok, I'd have a very hard time eating through Daredevil or characters like Hulk, even. Just being able to put a good amount of a mystic attack into them really helps. Same for wizards, just being able to go into physical when they're not under book's turn, but then swap to mostly energy when they're on the book turn. Makes a surprisingly effective difference. Like even if the dice pool's not the biggest difference, like I agree with you, it's at best difference between 2 and 3 dice is at best marginal. But when you get to go through their defensive deck, it's where it's where it makes the difference in the world, the biggest difference in the world.
Yeah, 100%. I think before we move on from characters, the last thing I want to talk about is this is obviously a list that is post balance patch. How did the balance pass affect the creation of this list? Did it like open it up its availability? Could it not have existed before? Did it just help you discover the list? Because you have
I
3 characters that were impacted here. Arguably, Black Cat was impacted almost not at all, right? With the buff and the debuff. But like Hela and Electra were impacted greatly here.
Yeah, honestly, I don't think before the balance patch that list would have been viable, just straight up. Because I think Electra's the probably the character I play. Electra's the character I play the most out of this list, like period. Uh, More than any of the leaders, like she's just always on the table, or almost always on the table. And both her and Hela were really big, huge surprise. Like when the balance patch came out locally, we'd like to experiment a lot with new characters, new release, updated characters. So they were all on our radar just to put on the table and see how the updated versions feel. And Electra's been like the biggest surprise for me, where I didn't think like the little buff she got made that big of a difference. Just her attack turning into a gainer and that fourth physical defense also just is a world of difference.
Yeah. It means you don't have to spend her power as often, and she has twice as much power as she used to have.
She can actually build power to use
Yeah.
her spender now.
Yeah, and like the consistency of it. Man, I love gainers and this like new wave of design where they have like gainer plus
Yeah,
that they're building into some characters like Electra, where Electra is 1 power, 2 power if damage, or the Hulkbuster Tony the Mark II repulsor, which is if miss 1 power, if damage that much power.
yeah.
Like I love those. Those characters they feel so good, and I'm
Yeah, I
not.
really like that design space. I think it opens up very interesting avenues and ways to balance superpowers and attacks together. It's a very nice line to thread.
Yeah, it creates reliability in a very swingy game
Yeah,
that feels really good.
yeah, I agree. And I think for Hela, which is probably the second biggest impacted character for this list, I think that's embrace the mobility it gives her, especially on like wide scenarios and beta flips, makes such a big difference because then she's usually able to move. That's embrace, then fire an attack, then flip a trap. It like the difference in action compression it makes is really huge. Sure, she loses it on the injured side, but then she gets to not die pretty often. So I think it's a trade I'm very comfortable doing
Yeah. My
because
God,
they
she'd be
the
so
game.
silly if she had it on both sides.
Oh yeah, I think she'd probably be on the too good side.
Yeah,
But
and
like
like yeah, go ahead.
oh yeah, but like having that flexibility, that tempo ability early on is where you need it the most. Either to apply scenario or attrition pressure, as when she gets dazed, you need to keep your characters, keep your activations. So I think the spread of ability she has works just really well in the game overall, but doubly so in this list.
Yeah, 100% agreed. I think Hela's super cool. All right, so I want to move over into into tactics cards because you have some really interesting stuff here. So the usual stuff out of the way here. You have this is a robbery
Right.
for Rhino and doing the classic criminal. I'm gonna steal your stuff nonsense. Eyes on the prize, like the classic grab stuff, fallback protection. Uh, Restricteds are sacrifice brace. These make sense. Keep your characters alive, right? Usurp, I fell out of fashion really hard in CS and has had a huge comeback recently. I think largely because of its interaction with All According to Plan.
Yeah.
And the very first thing I noticed when I played your list is how easy playing All According to Plan is in this list, with like everyone is a criminal.
Yeah. And for me, that's one of the big things is like there's two big aspects that come up, especially with All According to Plan, is fueling it is super easy. You have a lot of characters that build power surprisingly well. So you're because for me, like if we take back mostly CS, Kingpin CS lists, if they're splash heavy, it's harder to funnel the card. And one of the things I really disliked about a lot of ways I was seeing according to plan played is that stripping 10 power from your list really impacts negatively what your characters can do. And that for me was a big drawback to the card where if you can steal prio and not do anything relevant with it, well, you just spend 10 power to double move away. And I really
Yeah.
dislike that. And that's one of the things I really ended up liking about this list is all according to plan is not an all scenario. Like I'm not playing this, it's not an every game card. But whenever I get to play it, for me it's super important to have a very high impact activation
Mm-hmm.
if I'm stealing prio. Because 10 power is a lot. Like
Yes.
it diminishes the effectiveness of your team very drastically. So I need to have that one or two characters that are able to like go to town and really steal an activation away, kill a kaiju, and just take a really gross turn, uh, and keep that momentum alive. Like, and for me, that's where it comes in, and one of the biggest, one of the easiest things actually to do with this list is play all according to plan effectively, as opposed to a lot of older CS lists.
Yeah. Okay. So you talk a lot about having like a really big impact, and I think like a lot of CS lists, like when you see, I see this card played in Kingpin, like the biggest impact thing they do is like Black Cat. They leave Black Cat with 3 power. She steals a thing and moves long away. Right, and you're like, oh, okay. So who are your leadoff hitters here? Like, what are we talking about? Like, so if I could take a guess, I assume that Killmonger pretty important to this. What you want to elaborate?
Yeah, I think Killmonger here, if I'm playing both Killmonger and All According to Plan, just be able to have Killmonger go and usually use his Usurp the Throne turn, which I ended up setting up the round prior. So being able to like really go to town, steal that 2VP, days or KO, an important model, makes a huge difference. Like if you're playing against a scenario team, because Killmonger here is really for me in this list, he's really a surgical tool. I don't use him super often, but he's there to answer a few problematic matchups. I think this list, both Claw and Modok handle kaijus super well, with both their leaderships and their respective toolkits. Uh, but they have a hard time going at it at like white lists. Like we see right now, wide webs is super popular. Just Hellfire Club in general tends to play pretty wide to leverage their leadership effectively. And for me, those are like the two most important matchup in which I tend to feel Killmonger. Like if I don't expect something more than a 4 or 5 threat on the opposing side of the board, I'll usually bring Killmonger out because if you have your a buffet of 4 threats to choose through to choose up for Rise of the Throne. Being able to like catch up on scenarios with that 2VP and put additional attrition pressure really helps alleviate the scenario pressure they put on you and the scoring pressure they can put.
All right. What? Who else though? Like, so like obviously you said you're not playing. You're only playing Killmonger in those situations where he has like a buffet of choices.
Yeah.
Like, so I'm playing all according to plan, but it's not like a Killmonger matchup. Like, who's your leadoff hitter?
I think the characters I usually like it the most are Electra, Ulick, and Claw.
Mhm.
Just because with Electras, as I said, and I think the my streamed game at LVO is a very good example of
Yeah,
this,
she kills an eye Hulk.
uh, where I just stole Prio from my opponent to be able to try and KO their Immortal Hulk, which had just flipped, well, quote unquote flipped.
Yeah,
Uh,
just
so
gone
that
through the green door.
Yeah. So to be able to have like my ninjas double attack Hulk, then Electra move and impale him and KO him off the board top of round three, like is a huge tempo swing. And that's the kind of play I'm looking for. Like Electra being able to KO a very important model or steal a very important activation away. Um, be it characters like Thanos. Like reality Electra is surprisingly efficient at finishing reality Thanos with her spender. Like she's not super good into building damage into him, but if you want to daze him, she's probably your best bet. And just being able to do that very effectively is pretty gross. The other one that I I take from a recent game at LVO. I was playing against Hulk and had Ulick build power off fighting Hulk. Then I stole Prio, did the spender to try to steal Hulk activation away. Worst case scenario, you get the stagger, but just being able to effectively really steal a lot of momentum from your opponent is what I'm typically looking for.
Yeah, I like the Ulick leadoff as well. And then he can also obviously double as the eyes on the prize,
Yeah.
or yeah, eyes on the prize character if like points work out better that way, or you really want the Ulick pickup. Okay, so other cards that I think are really cool in here. So we talked a little bit about Cruel Tutelage. I don't think we talked about. Do you ever use it to like build power on a character as like a way to like cheat power onto a character that's really important? Can you talk a little bit about
Uh,
that?
Yeah, I usually that's not the typical way I usually do it, but I sometimes do it, especially if I'm playing under Kingpin. It's where it gets used more to build power, especially in characters like Black Cat very early on. It's something I had actually just done to me at LVO 2022,
Mm-hmm.
uh, where my opponent just cruel tutelage on their Black Cat to get a huge chunk in and build power super quickly with her. I was pretty scary. Um, that's actually a play pattern I like a lot. Or even if I need an important trigger, like usually I'll try to pair it with strong attack or a spender to get the triggers. I think Ulick's a good example, being able to steal an activation or Electro on the spender to just increase that dice pool and have like a mini Helios laser,
Mm-hmm.
so
Yeah,
to speak, uh, comes in really really clutch. Uh, Building power is a very nice upside for it, but it's not the way I typically use it. But on characters like even Bullseye, it can come in pretty clutch. Like it still becomes a 7 die gainer, and you don't care so much if Bullseyes get staggered.
yeah. Who cares? It's new threat. He's only going to do one damage next turn instead of two. Oh
Yep.
no. So I think cruelty's really clever here. I I think it gives you a pretty interesting like Killmonger assurance, or just like all according to plan coming out of it to try to be like, oh, my final attack needed to do two, it did one. Let's take another 5 die shot at this for two
Yep.
power. Are there any other interesting ways that cruelty is used, or is that the primary one?
Uh, just honestly, like at this point, it's almost a meme. But the amount of times you leave an important character on 1 or 2 health makes the biggest difference in the world. I think the two other characters that tend to use it the most in my list are Electra and Bullseye,
Yeah.
just because they have these extra effects attached to it. Like Bullseye gets to do I Never Miss Again, so he can pretty much guarantee 3 chip damage to finish up a model. So that's really good. And Electra actually refunds a power from it, thanks to Out for Blood. So it doesn't hurt her power economy as much as the others. Um, I think those are probably my three main picks. But just having that flexibility of like, oh no, I left that model on one. I really needed that daze or KO. Just being able to reach for it. Um, Another big upside is that cruelty. If I was playing a more splash heavy list, it would matter more. But cruelty is not does not require a CS character to play the card.
Oh, really?
So yeah, it's
That's awesome.
CS locked, but any character can play the card, which is pretty significant. Like if I was playing a splash heavier list, it would come in handy. I think one of the best users of cruelty is actually Domino, just because cruelty specifies that you can't add dice except for crits.
Mm,
But with characters like Domino or Malekith that can turn your skulls into crit, or any characters with a reality gem, it becomes really gross.
yeah, ally
Um,
character. Yeah, it's so good.
and one of the things that's also really nice is since it's a range 5 attack, uh, usually a character that's going to try to fall back out of range, you can still get them.
Oh yeah, like
Uh,
you spend her with Electra, leave him on one,
yeah,
and then you can like still run back and be like cruelty. Yeah.
yeah, there you go. Like even if they fall back or if you move away back to safety, like all of these little use cases tend to come up surprisingly often. Like just leave. How I think anyone can relate to leaving an important model on one or
Yeah.
two, and cruelty's there for that. Basically, it's just always that last nail in a coffin that takes it home and makes the biggest difference in the world. And that's why it's my most played tactics card after my restricted cards.
All right. And the last one I want to talk about here is Sucker. I got blown out by Sucker so bad a couple games ago, where like Malekith killed Nick Fury, like kind of spiked Nick Fury, and then took all his power so he couldn't play Eye to protect him, Eye or Sack to protect himself, and then finish the
Yeah.
job. Uh, Tell me about this card and why you're using it and why it's making this comeback.
For LVO, it was a very last minute addition because I had like Ultron. I was expecting a lot of Ultron 2 overall in the field. But even besides Ultron 2, it helps play around exceptional healing if you're playing a lot of Logans. Sorry. If you're playing against a lot of Logans, it helps cripple CGR and Thanos. Um, it's just a really good card to hurt the power economy of models that can really devastate your team. And it's in this list specifically, it's a lot easier to set up just because your characters tend to daze and die really quickly. So
Mm.
having two injured characters isn't as hard as it is in most lists. So it's easier to play Sucker and try to like steal effective activations away uh, and leverage that tempo. Like I know it's come up a lot in our discussion here, but I think if I had to really sum up how this list plays, is just really to you want to be in control and dictate the pace of the game as much as you can.
It's
Like
like really tempo.
you want to have your opponent play on your terms at all times, and that's one of the hardest things to like get into when you're playing this list is when you need to apply very strong pressure, when you need to ease off, and that back and forth. I think, especially with Claw's leadership, takes some time getting used to. But since it's easy to like identify your mistakes and course correct, I think you can get the hang of it fairly quickly. And Sucker for me is basically an extension of that, where it's just another tool you can use to apply pressure very effectively. Um, I'm still on the fence between Sucker and Shadow Org, just because I'm still playing a high density of CS character. But I think like that last slot is mostly a meta call, and I wouldn't fault anyone for playing either of those cards.
Absolutely. And since we're talking about that, I think I kind of want to wrap this thing up with talking about how this list, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like this list was very much a meta read of what you thought LVO was going to be because this list seems very good into the big boogeyman of CGR with having multiple models that can't be pulled by him, right? Having pretty good like tricks for dealing with like the Mystic Spender, and can you just talk a little bit about like what you expected, how the list countered that, and if the meta moves, what pieces would come out of this list if you still wanted to play it.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly correct assessment, and I think like, and I ended up going 3-3 with that list at LVO, but I think that came up mostly to me not being very practiced with Modok leadership. Like I spent a lot of time trying to figure out and play Claw properly, and to have like that Modok backup plan. But with the matchups I ended up playing Modok Modok leaderships most of my game, and I think here. Um, Claw's just great into most attrition teams and attrition scenarios, so that in the current meta is pretty good. I think the big, uh, the big affiliations I was expecting were Webs and Hellfire, and I think Hellfire is a somewhat tough matchup for that team, but that's where Ulick and Killmonger are at their best, and you can try to leverage them super effectively there. Um, and I think it plays very well into the meta. Like you said, I think it's a very meta dependent. Like this list is very effective in the current meta, but I still expect it to be just good overall because of its inherent flexibility. I think depending on what's going to come out and how the meta is going to adapt, that list will need to adapt and change a lot with how the meta evolves. Like I think it has the upside of being very flexible and with your tech pieces. Like I could see a world where it's all kaiju's and take Killmonger out, and just being able to swap those characters in and out because you're not particularly attached to them. Like I think the only core, I want to say core pieces of this list are basically Hela and Electra, then your leaders. So you have like 5 characters you can play around with depending on what you expect, what you think you're going to see, and what dominates the competitive scene.
Sounds great. So I think we're going to call it here. Is there any place, anything you want to plug? Where can they find you? Do you want to plug your blog that I know about?
Yeah. So I'm VodkaBlitz I'm on most MCP Discord at this point. Um, I'll just do a shout out to my locals, the Montreal Shark Tank, very cool travel group. We tend to play most big events on the East Coast. I've also been writing a blog for a little over 2 years now, mostly centered on X-Men, what is what I've been known to play competitively for the better part of 2 years. Um, that CS stint was me just being a little tired of having played X-Men competitively for 2 years, basically nonstop. Uh, and it gave me a very nice and different change of pace and perspective. So if you want to read my blog, it's First Class, MCP First Class. You can Google it, find it. You can find me on most Discord. Feel free to like ask me questions, whether about that list or X-Men. I'm usually pretty responsive, so that's it for my pluggables.
All right. And with that, this has been VodkaBlitz. I'm Vincent Curkov, and don't forget that fun is a finite resource.